You feel it the moment you wake up. A burning pain in your throat. A pounding headache that makes every movement miserable. Half asleep. You walk to the medicine cabinet, swallow a tiny white pill, and within an hour you have almost forgotten the whole experience. But have you ever stopped to wonder? That ordinary little pill is hiding a secret, a legacy our ancestors once paid for with their lives. 59,000 years ago? That same sore throat could have killed you in less than a week? There were no pharmacies, no doctors. The only things you could rely on were your tribe, the warmth of a campfire, and a handful of precious knowledge that had somehow survived the passage of time, waiting to be passed from one generation to the next, until it finally reached you. To truly understand the desperation of that world, all you have to do is look at a single tooth. Archaeologists once made a remarkable discovery inside the jaw of an ancient Neanderthal. One badly decayed tooth contained a tiny hole that had been drilled directly into its root using a sharpened stone, while the person was still alive. There was no anesthesia, no painkillers, no mercy from the pain itself, only another human being, perhaps a trusted friend, perhaps someone they barely knew, holding a steady hand while draining an abscess deep inside the tooth. They endured unimaginable agony for one fragile hope, that the unbearable pain of today might become tomorrow's chance to survive. That was not cruelty, it was the dawn of medicine. But for every story that ended with a miraculous recovery, dozens of others vanished into silence. There was a time when many families buried more children than they ever watched grow up. Researchers estimate that in ancient hunter-gatherer societies, 1 out of every 4 children died before reaching their first birthday. Many parents brought 10 children into the world with one heartbreaking hope, that perhaps 3 would survive long enough to become adults. That was the price humanity paid for every unfamiliar plant they tasted, every primitive operation they attempted, every lesson they passed to the next generation. In those days, trial and error was never just a scientific idea. It was paid for in blood, in human lives, again and again, until hard-won knowledge slowly became the inheritance that protects us today. Now let us turn to another chapter in humanity's fight for survival. Deep inside Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, archaeologists discovered the remains of a man who lived to nearly 50 years old, an extraordinarily advanced age for that time. His right arm had been gone for years, and he was blind in one eye. By every ruthless law of natural selection, he should have died decades earlier. He could no longer hunt. He could no longer gather food. From a purely biological perspective, he had become what many would call a burden. And yet his tribe refused to abandon him. They sheltered him, fed him, protected him. They kept the flame of his life burning for years after nature itself had given up on him. This may be the oldest and most extraordinary evidence of healthcare ever discovered on Earth. There was no hospital, no physician with advanced medical training. There were only ordinary human beings who refused to let one of their own die alone in the cold. But compassion alone could never defeat disease. Humans needed real weapons against illness, and they found them in the last place anyone would expect, beneath the green canopy of the forest. High in the frozen Alps, archaeologists discovered the 5,300-year-old mummy known as Ötzi, the Iceman. Hanging from a leather cord were 2 carefully preserved pieces of birch polypore fungus. Decades later, scientists made a remarkable discovery. This ancient fungus contains powerful antibacterial and antiparasitic compounds, suggesting that Ötzi was carrying one of the world's earliest known natural medicines. Ötzi was not carrying those fungi as lifeless decorations. He was carrying his own medical kit, a prehistoric first aid kit assembled through generations of hard-won experience, long before humanity had the faintest idea what bacteria even were. Humans had also discovered that chewing willow bark could ease pain at least 3,000 years ago. Hidden beneath that bitter bark is a compound called salicin, which your body naturally converts into salicylic acid after you swallow it. Then, in 1897, chemists working for a company called Bayer succeeded in creating a stable form of that very compound. They called it aspirin. That tiny white tablet sitting quietly inside your medicine cabinet today is, in a very real sense, the direct descendant of the molecules your ancestors once scraped from the rough bark of a tree thousands of years ago. But the history of medicine was never built around a single molecule. It stretches across the entire planet, reaching into forgotten corners of human civilization that few people ever talk about. High in the cloud-covered Himalayas, traditional healers roasted fresh ginger over glowing embers to drive away the cold and ease fevers. A simple remedy still passed from one family to the next today, far away in West Africa. The bark of certain trees was carefully boiled to eliminate parasites. Centuries before humanity ever looked through its very first microscope. Deep within the Amazon rainforest, indigenous communities somehow learned to identify plants containing compounds remarkably similar to modern painkillers and anesthetics. Different continents, different plants, different cultures, yet all of them arrived at the same destination through a single journey. One woven from desperation, hard-won wisdom, countless experiments, tragic deaths, and memories carefully passed from one generation to the next. But for every plant that could heal, another stood ready to kill. Ancient people were not born with perfect knowledge. They usually learned the difference only after it was too late. Countless families paid the ultimate price simply because someone chose the wrong leaf. This is the chapter history books rarely dwell on. Medicine was never a straight line of glorious discoveries leading steadily toward progress. It was, in truth, a vast graveyard of failed experiments, with only a handful of miracles scattered in between. And when herbs were no longer enough, our ancestors ventured far beyond what most of us can imagine. In Spain, archaeologists uncovered a 5,000-year-old human skull bearing a perfectly clean opening cut directly through the bone. It was not the result of violence. It had been made deliberately by human hands using a carefully crafted stone tool. More astonishing still, the skull showed unmistakable signs of healing. The man survived the operation. This was trepanation, the oldest known surgical procedure in human history. Evidence of it has been discovered on every continent where humans have lived, from Peru to France to China. Studies estimate that between 50 and 90% of patients actually survived these astonishing operations. Based on the new bone that later grew around the edges of the surgical opening, this was not reckless desperation. These were procedures that had been practiced, refined, and passed down through countless generations. Someone in every tribe had to remember which plants could heal, how to open a skull without killing the patient, and when intervention was worth the risk, that person was the healer, the tribe's most valuable living library. At a 12,000-year-old Natufian burial site, archaeologists uncovered the grave of a female healer. She had been buried with more than 80 tortoise shells, eagle wings, a leopard's tail, and the remains of a wild boar. Her burial was the most elaborate in the entire site. Because when a healer died, an entire tribe could lose its accumulated medical knowledge in a single moment. And now let us talk about fever, something modern medicine spent decades trying to suppress with cold compresses and cooling treatments. As it turns out, that instinct was often misguided. A fever is not a sign that your body is failing. It is your immune system deliberately raising your temperature to create an environment where many dangerous pathogens struggle to survive. Ancient people understood this thousands of years ago, even if they had no idea why it worked. Across hunter-gatherer societies around the world, anthropologists have found the same remarkable pattern. When someone developed a fever, they were brought closer to the fire, wrapped in warmth and protected from the cold. No one tried to cool them down. Their bodies were allowed to burn, because that fire was part of the healing itself. Only within the past century has science finally uncovered why that ancient instinct was so remarkably accurate. 300,000 years of living alongside death taught our ancestors something that modern medicine has only confirmed over the last few decades. They had no laboratories, no microscopes. They knew nothing about bacteria. So how did all of that knowledge survive for tens of thousands of years? Until it finally reached you. The answer can be summed up in one word: memory. Not science as we define it today, but patient observation, endless repetition, and stories passed from one generation to the next, from the lips of an elder to the ears of a child, beside a crackling fire, for hundreds of thousands of years. The next time you swallow an aspirin, remember that you are touching a chain stretching back 50,000 years. A chain that leads to an ancestor sitting inside a dark cave, chewing on a piece of bitter tree bark. They had no idea why it worked. They only knew that somehow it kept them alive. We did not invent medicine. We inherited it. It was purchased with the lives of those who came before us, refined through memory, and carried forward by every tribe that refused to abandon one of its own to suffer alone. And somewhere in the world, even at this very moment, there are still people quietly experimenting, patiently observing, and pushing human knowledge one small step further. The tools may have changed, but the nature of humanity never has.